In open skill sports, acceleration is the one ring to rule them all. Cutting, juking, bursting through a seam are all pivotal to sporting success, especially when it comes to speed. But what about when you're sprinting towards the finish line? You're heading for the end zone, you're chasing down a ball. I'm gonna give you the best exercise that you can use to improve your max speed, and we're gonna start right now. So a key element of max speed is having minimal ground contact. So one of the big factors around max speed is that it can be really hard to train with specific movements in the gym. It can even be really hard to train out on the track. You genuinely have to be doing things at maximal speed. I do believe there's a couple key exercises that you can do to build into that max speed. And in this case, I believe that simpler is often better. So one specific exercise that I like to use is getting a technique stick here, okay? We can get into a position and we can focus on how our hips are gonna be, how our trunk control is here in this position. And we wanna be upright, and we can just sort of start, boom, boom, and we can focus on how we're feeling in this dorsiflex position. Now, one thing I want to bring up is that there's a couple sports scientists that believe that you should hold dorsiflexion in the ankle at max speed. There's a couple other sports scientists that will say that that's stupid and you shouldn't be doing those things. I believe you probably should be, based off of what we're seeing in slow motion videos, how the best in the world run. Look at somebody like Justin Gatlin from a technical perspective. I can't wait to read all the comments that Justin Gatlin was on drugs and his technique doesn't matter. But when we're looking at it, that's typically what's going to occur. Now, back to this specific drill. We're gonna be in this position, boom, 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 boom. And if you notice, I had a little bit of a skip there in the beginning. And you can feel that gut right away, okay? You can feel that position immediately as you're doing that. One thing that you can do then, if you're in a session and you're trying to potentiate and prime your nervous system and you're focusing on max speed, is you can get into a little bit of a position where we're here, and that's something that you can do for like 5 to 6 sets of 15 to 20 meters to warm up, to feel that quick ground contact and that rapid recovery. But this isn't the best exercise for maximal speed. When we're talking about max speed, I believe that the simpler is better approach tends to be the best way that you can go about training. When we're looking at max speed, we've got to understand that there is going to be a shorter time frame of ground contact. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily mean that resistance-based training is going to be the worst for max speed. That doesn't necessarily mean that doing things in the gym are going to be horrible for max speed. But what does end up happening is that they will not be the absolute best. We've got to comprehend that ground reaction is going to get shorter and shorter and shorter as we start to sprint at that top end speed. I believe that is all going back to impulse. The amount of force that you're going to be applying in a very, very short period of time is going to be extraordinarily high when you're running at max speed. So we've got to comprehend impulse, or as we refer to it in this specific scenario, blast impulse is going to be a huge carryover to that max velocity. But what else can be done to improve max speed? There is the use of a lighter sled and velocity decrement. So when we're looking at using a weighted sled, one of the downfalls is that you're still gonna be increasing that ground contact time. Because you're still using resistance-based training, you're actually gonna be focusing more on acceleration. Now, there is really good research out there that if you can run faster at high speeds, your acceleration will also be faster. You will get to higher velocity quicker. Also, if you can accelerate quickly, your max speed will likely be faster as well. So in this case specifically, using a sled can be very, very effective. Now, one of the ways that you can use this without getting into some crazy scientific formula is to just say, let's start with about 10% of our body weight, okay? So we can put 10% of our body weight on the sled and use that as a means of improving our strength when we're sprinting. Let's say I weigh 230 in pounds. I'll take that, I put 23 pounds on or 25 pounds on the sled, and I can use that for sprinting at 30, 40, 50 yards, something along those lines, 30, 40, 50 meters. And what ends up happening is you tend to see an increase in the time to cover a sprint distance, let's say 40 or 50 meters, that you otherwise wouldn't see if you were running without the sled. So we've just got to be aware of that. Now, one thing that I think is important to do that we've been doing a little bit with some of our football guys is that we can look at this and say, if we have a guy who runs like a 4.65, where does he have and what weight is on the sled if he's running, let's say with 10% of his body weight? Can he get over 30 yards and still run a 4.65 to 30 yards with that extra weight on the sled? So you can start to get a little unique with how you're training somebody, and this is where using that velocity decrement does come into play. However, it's not the absolute best in regards to max speed. It's going to be more about acceleration. Now, again, it's still going to have a positive transfer over to that max speed eventually. So what's another exercise that is faster and more conducive to max speed? Now, another great way that we can train max speed is by using a little bit slower movements, but by training the nervous system here to fire very, very rapidly. And that's gonna take us into a really freaking unique exercise. This is gonna be similar to what we're doing when we're doing the skips into that recovery position with the technique stick. Now, it's gonna be a little bit more loaded. There's gonna be a greater stretch shortening cycle, so it's gonna be a little bit more advanced. First of all, let's say that I'm gonna have a setup position where I have my swing leg here. I have the dumbbell in the same hand as my swing leg. And what I wanna see is I'm gonna drop this, okay? So I'm gonna drop, boom. Now, what I recommend is that if you're learning how to do this movement, you actually go through this using the 5S protocol. You can go slow here, you can go stop, you can go stutter here, and you can almost do like a little hitch, and then you can get into that more specificity where we have more speed. So we're here, boom, and then we're gonna come forward. Now, what I recommend here, boom, boom. As we get through this movement, the drop dumbbell snatch to a hip block or the drop dumbbell snatch to the box, we want to go faster, okay? So we're gonna be here, here, use that speed. That movement that I just showed you is gonna be a little bit greater for acceleration. The next one is probably gonna be a better version of this for max speed. And this is where it gets a little bit harder because you have to have that trunk control. Boom, boom. Now I'm in this position here. When we're doing this drop dumbbell snatch, one thing we can think about is toe off here. So we don't want to be in this flat position. Typically what we want to see when we're sprinting at max speed, you will be grounding almost like this. So he'll be in this position here. So when we're doing something like that drop snatch, ideally you would work towards that position. If we catch in the hip lock, slight bend, slight bend, slight bend in the knee, okay, the whole way through. If we're going to the box, I want to think about toe off position here where we're going to have a little bit more extension from the knee and the hip. Good hip recovery, getting into that dorsiflex position. I can't wait to hear all the sports scientists get triggered and comment down below that I'm wrong. But this exercise is still too slow. So again, when we're looking at max speed, we've got to think about minimal ground contact time, okay? That's really where the principles of impulse come into play. And one thing that we've got to think about is using some unique plyometrics. One thing that I like to do when we're thinking about plyometric based training and we're thinking about max speed training at the exact same time, what we can actually set up is have some type of potentiation with plyometrics that also then might lead into some sprint training with a sled or without the sled. One thing that I can do is I want to show you a skips for distance, okay, with quick ground contact time. And then I'm gonna show you the second plyometric movement that you can use. And we're gonna add in a little bit of flavor. I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of an alternative as well if you don't have access to, in this case, our wickets. So when we're looking at something like a skips for distance, okay, one thing I also wanna preface here is that when we're doing this, it's gotta be a quick reaction. It's almost like ba-bump, ba-bump, okay, very, very quick out of the actual skip. The other aspect, and the reason why I like to use these for max speed, is because it can have a little bit of a protective mechanism on the hamstring. It's getting your athletes to fire extraordinarily fast without putting a ton of stress on their overall system. So it's gonna look like this. Hopefully I don't mess this up, but I have 2 wickets set up where I'm gonna do almost as like target practice. If you don't have mini hurdles in this case, you can even just use football markers. If you're on a football field, you can use the yard marker. So we're here. This. And the big thing that we wanna think about is driving up, having that same position that we had when we were actually doing the technique stick with the rapid switches. This position leading and driving extending, okay, that's gonna help us feel that max speed position. We also want very rapid ground time. If we think about impulse, it's a short period of ground contact time with an ungodly high level of force. And that's gonna be what helps us to run faster. So the next exercise that we can use is going to be like a single leg bound. Again, we want to think about rapid reaction, rapid reaction. So in this case here, we could set up where we go boom, 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 okay? And we want to think about coming through with that knee. The other thing that I like about using something like these mini hurdles, if you notice, when I jump on my left leg, I can project pretty well. I can hold that position pretty well. I'm gonna try to do my best. Typically what ends up happening is I'll rotate a little bit with that right leg here. Boom, 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 God. And my drive from that knee is not as strong. We can use this as a teaching tool. We can also see stride length. It's gonna stick out quite a bit where their problems might be when they're actually running at top end speed. You can use drills like this to try to get rid of any of those unique problems that a sprinter might have. So I recommend if you would do this, let's say you work through 5 sets of 20 yards, 5 sets of 30 yards, with the quick skips for distance. Try to video it on your cell phone and look at it and say, to get 20 yards, it took 7 strides or whatever it might be. And then try to decrease that so you can apply more force in a short period of time. That will transfer better over to max speed. If we use this as a wicket target for single leg bounds, it's the same concept. You can have 20 yards set. Let's just pretend that it's 9 to 10 strides on the right leg or on the left leg. Try to decrease that, but make sure that both legs have that sense of equality so that you have a more structurally balanced athlete. So both these exercises are absolutely fantastic, but they are not the best exercise. So what the is that best exercise? So before we give you the absolute best exercise, it's important to realize that all the movements that we gave you prior to this are still very, very good for improving that max speed. They are not the absolute best, but they're absolutely fantastic movements, and they're exercises that we have inside of our strength training app, Peak Strength. If you guys head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store, you can download Peak Strength, and we're gonna have a periodized program specific to your sport, to your needs, even to where you are in regards to in-season training or out-of-season training. Again, head over to peakstrength.app, download that today. You'll get 5 free workouts. That first week is free so that you guys can get on the path to becoming a champion. Now, when we're looking at the absolute best exercise for max speed, it's going to come down to something very, very simple, and that's going to be sprinting. Sorry, this is not some grand Illuminati scheme. This is actually what it should be. We've got to get out on the track and run at high speeds, 50, 60, 70, potentially 80 meters. And at some points in the season, as we start to build into this and we start to have a decent amount of strength, you can have a very, very slight grade downhill that can also lead to that maximal speed. But sprint training is obviously going to be the absolute best thing that's going to carry over to max speed. Oftentimes in most sports, we will rarely ever get to max velocity. But if we're a sprinter or potentially a football player like a wide receiver, that might tend to happen, and we still need to do some work at that high end speed. And again, that's gonna be something that we have to train our body to do. We have to prepare the body and then get the body used to it. In some cases, it's gonna take time for the athlete to learn that rapid speed. It's gonna take time to learn those rapid co-contractions. And these are all adaptations that will occur, and you can improve speed. I'm sure there's already someone who has spammed the comment section that believes that you can actually improve speed. But you can, especially if you head over to peakstrength.app and download our strength training app. Because remember, freaks, if you wanna become a champion, you've always gotta cultivate your power. Peace.